I can't, but
Might get louder.
Let's make sure it's working on the Book of Face in YouTube.
The Book of Face.
All right. Excellent. So, the we're staying. This place is right next to the hotel we're at. Is right next to the American church in Paris.
Oh my gosh. How cool. I've done Zoom stuff with them.
I know, but weren't you like working on going to be there in person at some point?
Well, I think so. They haven't finalized yet,
Okay.
but my sense is that I think it's probably about an 80% chance that I'll be there the last week of October and the first week of November, which means I will be out for the election, which will make me very happy. I might not want to come home.
Oh man, could you? We got 1 minute. Okay, so when all the Republicans just leave right before a black woman becomes a member of the Supreme Court, I mean, I just I don't know. I don't get why they can't just be quiet,
Well,
right?
it was the simplest thing to do. They could have done performative, I'm not a racist. You know, they could have sat there and sort of,
They
you
could have
know,
Mitt Romneyed.
yeah, they could have Mitt Romney, but I'm not sure. I think Mitt Romney actually has character, and I think he actually cares about issues like this. But they could have sat there and they could have lied with their bodies, and then we'd be talking about how they lied with their bodies. But at least they wouldn't have proved the point, because as soon as they walked out, it was like, yeah, just tell the entire world that you're a racist jerk. And you're always saying, oh, I'm not a racist jerk. But when a black woman gets elected to be on the Supreme Court, and you decide that you're going to be like South Carolina during the Civil War and turn around and walk out because you're irked.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, oh you boys aren't racist. You're just worried about the children falling victim
Mhm.
to all those pedophiles.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Just like, I have no patience. I have no
Maybe
patience.
they were trying to hurry to one of Matt Gates get-togethers. And
Well, I don't know if you saw, but Paul Gosar announced his plans. Paul Gosar from my second home state of Arizona. He announced that he was going to spend Hitler's birthday at a white supremacist rally in Arizona. And so, okay, nobody has said anything about this. So apparently it's okay with Mitch McConnell if you go to a Hitler birthday party, as long as there's no cocaine and not an orgy.
oh man, I can't even, like, oh, Diana, during our election gatherings, I I deep down I just wish the Democratic Party was the conservative party in the country. So I just have to say, every time the Republicans do something like this, what they do is encourage those of us that kind of have to tolerate the Democratic Party and thinks that, like, the Democratic Party are the people that don't leave the bar because their friend's crazy as hell, because they're like, well, it'd be better if I am their DD. That's the Democratic Party. They're like, I'm not stopping the party and all the destruction. I'm just going to make sure they get home safe. And those of us that are much more left, they do this stuff, and you're like, all right, I guess I should still just keep voting for them. This is I'm like, they don't have any friends like me. If they did, they would have just sat there and gone.
I know I actually had said that on Twitter weeks ago, is that they should just perform not being racist. It was the perfect opportunity for them to pretend they weren't racist. And they blew.
Someone might believe it was about their judicial philosophy.
Right.
They're celebrating inclusion, all that kind of stuff. We're like, she just happens to have the wrong philosophy.
That's right. And the wrong skin color, apparently. So anyway, it was just like unbelievable to me. I was livid. I was literally shouting at the television.
Well,
look, they're walking out. And Ted Cruz stands up and buttons his jacket in this very specific way, making sure that the camera is right on him and then as soon as he knows he's got the floor, he turns around and he's the last one in the line walking out of the room. It's like, oh, brother,
if he was like pulling out his plane ticket to Cancun, then it would be a little more on point.
I'm sorry. There are a couple people who are asking in our little pre-show chat here that what's going on. This was all after the vote. So after the Senate voted to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson as the next that Supreme Court seat, the Republicans got up and walked out, except for Mitt Romney. And I didn't see what happened with Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, but I'm assuming they stayed. But I definitely saw Mitt Romney stayed. And everybody else made this big show and turned around and just sort of, picked up their ball and left. It was like watching a bunch of. Yeah. Believe me, the Duke team behaved better after losing to UNC. And that is saying
I was not going to bring that up, Diana. I wasn't going to bring it up.
So anyway, it was very hurtful. And a lot of women, of course, noticed it immediately, especially a lot of Black women. But the great part is that they were trying to get attention and they wanted to hurt people. And so, basically people noted it, people commented on it, and then said, and isn't this amazing? What a remarkable woman is now on the Supreme Court. And this is the way history changes. So,
yeah. Well, before I hit record, this would be a good time to remind people that if you like hanging out with us, then you should join the college and be a member in the homebrewed community, because Diane and I get together, monthly-ish, and do, we do hangouts. We talk about religion, pop culture, politics, those kind of things that are in the news, and then whatever questions and such you send, which, given all the questions that have been sent, Diane, we have months and months of Q&A possibilities available to us. So everyone should, if you aren't a full member of the college, you should upgrade, join the homebrewed community, and you can all hang out. Also, I'll send a survey after I'm back from Paris. And one of the questions would be like, next time Diana and I do a class, what should we talk about? You should tell us that, because we would love to do something together again next time, where those of you that have enjoyed this go like, oh, what if this was the topic, kind of thing. But respond there. You can discuss it in the chat, but I'm not reading the chat while you talk. It's hard to do that.
It is. It's very hard to do that.
We have to skim. I won't remember by the time I get home. And for those of you that go, maybe Tripp derails in a different way today and looks kind of tired. It is because it's 11 o'clock here in Paris, and I got on a plane at 3 o'clock Paris time in the morning to get here.
And you're sitting behind drapes.
It is true. There are drapes. I got this fancy room that has premium internet so we could hang out, and there aren't walls in this multi-room thing. There's thick drapes, like theater drapes.
Oh, okay.
But none of my family members have complained for me talking so far, so I think we're good.
I kind of like, do, we have subdued.
I could lean over
tonight.
Like this.
That's right.
Hey, Diana, how are you doing?
I wonder how that will change the whole dynamic, because you have to be a little quieter.
Well,
And
I'll probably forget in about 20
I
minutes.
did actually just sort of catch somebody's comment on the chat. And what city are you in? Someone asked. He's literally in Paris, right there in the background. That's where he is.
Yeah, my actual the actual window here is blurred, and so I was like, that sinks. I thought I was going to actually get the Eiffel Tower view, so I uploaded a picture from outside the outside the hotel. Put it up here. Yeah.
Oh, I know where you are, though, right next to
Yeah.
the American Church in Paris. If anybody's been there, it's a great place.
Yes, it's like the backside. It's like a little wine shop, and then you turn the corner, and it's there. All
Great
right,
neighborhood.
we're gonna hit record.
Okay.
All right. Let me hit. There we go. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I am here with Diana Butler Bass, who's recovering from Duke's back-to-back beating by UNC Tar Heels.
Oh, please.
I noticed that.
I couldn't watch.
The Duke basketball is not. Your freeing Jesus is back in your background.
It is, but
only.
I did bring the basketball so I could just sort of hold it and cry into it.
It is we actually have quite a few members who have Duke and UNC connections in this group. See, we already have multiple Go Heels.
I'm not
going
looking
in the comments. When Carolina won, Will, who's in the group, who's a Lutheran minister in Chapel Hill, sent me his video and of them all running around, Franklin Street, and he's like, "Don't send this to Diana." I was like, well, anyway,
it's okay. All's fair in love and college basketball.
Yeah, as long as you don't hurt nobody.
That's right.
But this is final session. Here's what we're planning to do for the format for those of you listening, viewing at home. Diana's going to kick things off with a poem. Then we're going to talk about the end of her book. Then there are a bunch of questions around atonement, pain, shame, suffering, trauma. So I'm going to talk about that part of my book. We'll discuss those. And then we have an unlimited number of questions people send in. But if you have others, as it goes, use the Q&A section of the chat box. So that's what we're going to do. I'm looking forward to it. We're not going to ramble so that we can get more done. So with that, I will let Diana take it away.
And I wanted to start tonight with a poem by Denise Levertov that she, as a poet, actually structures as a prayer. And so this is what I've been trying to do the whole way through to meet the needs of our post-religious friends, as well as our friends who are still hanging on to church, is try to find these beautiful words that work as both poetry and prayer. And Denise Levertov, the wonderful contemporary poet, died a few years ago, has given us one such poem today, and it's about doubt and belief. So listen in, and to the different sort of modes that she picks up on in this prayer. I believe the earth exists, and in each minimum mote of its dust, the holy glow of thy candle. Thou unknown, I know. Thou spirit giver, lover of making, of the wrought letter, wrought flower, iron deed, dream. Dust of the earth, help thou my unbelief. Drift, gray become gold in the beam of vision. I believe with doubt. I doubt and interrupt my doubt with belief. Be, beloved, threatened world, each minimum mote, not the poisonous luminescence forced out of its privacy, the sacred lock of its cell broken. No, the ordinary glow of common dust in ancient sunlight. Be that I may believe. Amen.
Wow.
Yeah. I thought that was a good one for process theology too.
Yeah. Do you have like some Google Doc where you collect all these things? Like,
I should, but I don't. I just have all these books scattered all over my office with tons of little stickies in them. And I I tend to sort of remember certain clusters of them that I really like, and then I reprint them
mhm.
mostly. I try to put a poem every week, or sometimes two, in my Substack. And today, when I wrote about uh, evangelical history and sort of the all of the awfulness of evangelicalism of the 70s and 80s, in the cottage, I actually found a poem written by a woman who is a Black poet, and she has just published her first two books. And the poem that I put out today is addressed to, "Oh, evangelical God." And then it's all this terrible stuff that happened to her as a little girl growing up in the 80s, in this sort of poetic Amanda Gorman kind of style of poetry. And I literally, when I found this poem, I got so excited. My husband Richard could not believe that I actually found a poem that fit with evangelicalism in the 1980s. Says, "Oh, evangelical God, banter my heart," as you always did.
Oh my. Oh
It's a
my.
hilarious poem. Denise
Well,
O. Birdsong is her name. I
mhm.
highly recommend you looking her up. She's a very interesting writer and poet.
Yeah, I just hope everyone goes checks out Diana's recent cottage thing. When you sent me the New York Times piece, and I'm, packing up to go to Paris, and I start looking at it, I'm like, oh no, it's about to irritate me. And then it did. So it, it was nice to have texted the New York Times piece to friends, venting, followed by like, just read Diana's thing. It just make it all feel better. Like you'll go, this is what could happen if the New York Times had a semi informed religion person on their editorial board. But
And I thought it was interesting. One of the reasons I sent it to you, just so people get the whole context of the story, is that yesterday, early evening on the East Coast, I think it was at 6 o'clock, the New York Times published a story online about how evangelical worship styles were meshing with right-wing politics. And basically the argument was that this mixture of evangelical worship music and praise styles and sort of evangelical ethos, with anti-COVID politics, with pro-Trumpism, with against the election stuff, and QAnon, had all kind of come into a single piece, and that this was new and innovative, and that it showed the not only was evangelicalism politicized, but that politics was evangelicalized, essentially, that the Republican Party had become a worship party. And so anyway, the whole article, when I read it, it was like, well, wait a second. What about the 70s, because and the 80s and the 90s and the aughts? What about the whole last 40 years when the same thing has been happening? And so I sat down last night, and I was up until 3, writing the piece that some of you got today, on my Substack, which was basically saying, no, it's not an anomaly and it's not an innovation. What we see now is the trajectory that was established back in the 70s. I start my piece in 1980, but I know it started a bit before that. So it this whole movement has a history, and its tune may change, but the song has always been the same. And so that's what I wrote about. And I thought while I was writing it last night that it really fit in with so much stuff in our class, because hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have left evangelicalism for the very reasons that were put forth in that New York Times article. And then, of course, some of us did it earlier for the story that I tell in my article. So what the New York Times, I think, missed substantially, or didn't even mention in any way, shape, or form, is that there were any kind of dissenters to this evangelical, what was going on within evangelicalism, this shift. And it just sort of seems to think that all evangelicals kind of embrace it. And certainly, while I think the majority of people who are remaining evangelicals do in some way, shape, or form embrace what they were talking about, there's a lot of people who have said enough, and those are folks who are basically homeless right now, many of whom are with us and have been with us, for the last 6 weeks, and who are big fans of yours, Tripp, and homebrew Christianity. So that's what Tripp and I were talking about, that the New York Times piece, and then I responded to it, and I have been fielding responses to my response all day. So, which is good. Well, I'm glad for that.
And I think it actually fits with, what you were wanting to share at the front was kind of the beginning and ending, like the way you reframed your framing of the story in the book. So if you want to, transition in that, because I think one of the, or this might be more of a confessional than just true for everyone, but one of the things I really appreciated about Freeing Jesus and kind of the extending of the story is that for those of us that have left things behind and then found new ground and then had to leave things behind again and then found new ground, it's kind of like as the cycles move, then you don't see them so much as like destruction as much as more like waves. And you have a different sensibility going into it. And just recently having conversations about the kind of ones you have when you have kids getting to new ages and moving to new places and all that kind of stuff. It's nice to have an elder who goes like, yeah, don't freak out. Like this is just kind of part of it. And a lot of people who were in religious settings, their elders told them, don't leave, don't change your mind, don't ask that question, don't acknowledge that pain or that trauma, that kind of thing, as opposed to, yeah, that's part of the story. In fact, it's a freeing story, and it's one that still Jesus is in it. And that's one of the things I really loved about the book and personally found encouraging. So anyway, this me just being excited knowing what you're about to talk about.
And I don't want to go too long because I want to hear what you're going to say about the end of your book as well. But there's a lot that as a writer, that I try to do with structure. So it isn't just the ideas on a particular page or a thesis in a certain chapter that I'm running out so that you'll be able to read the story or understand the story, relate to the story I'm telling. But I also structure books really carefully to think about how the structure carries the story so that you have an experience of the story simply by the way that it's framed up. And so the 6 chapters that we talked about, friend, teacher, savior, Lord, way, and then I mentioned at the end last week, presence, which is sort of the post awful, tragic trauma chapter, because I didn't want to leave you with the trauma of that way chapter, but instead I extended it into where I am more or less now. So there's those 6 those 6 images, and they are intended to be more like kind of a spiral, or like water hitting a beach, and then a wave going out and a wave coming back in. So those 6 chapters are not necessarily about leaving, although I do leave some places and I do leave some ideas behind, but there's always a new kind of iteration of some level of the same thing that comes through. And so it becomes a very cohesive story, and it's a story of connection. So that's those 6 chapters. They're very internally connected, because I wanted I wanted my readers to know that I wasn't like 6 different people, or that I didn't have like 6 different experiences of Jesus, or that if you leave something behind, you can be selective about what you decide to take with you into the new place. And you don't have to just leave everything about your past or cut yourself completely off from it, unless you choose to, or unless there's some really good reason to do that. And that might be your story, and that's okay if it is. So that's those middle 6 chapters. But there's 2 devices that frame the book that I want to make sure people understand. And the book has a double start and a double ending, which is a little unusual. And I refer to it as the double parentheses of the book. So around the 6 chapters, there's 2 sets of parentheses. And the first parentheses starts with the first story, me in the Washington National Cathedral, hearing the voice, Jesus saying, "Get me out of here." And that story is a story that arcs all the way through the whole book, about freeing Jesus from the confines of dogma or specific kinds of religious institutions, and allowing Jesus to be free, to, in effect, roam the streets. And I'm going to say something nice about C.S. Lewis here. And so I hope that people appreciate that. But one of the things I always liked about Lewis was his comment about how Aslan is not a tame lion, and that basically the figure of Aslan is always kind of roaming the streets of the book, showing up at wherever Aslan will show up. And so that's really the story that I tell in that outside frame. And so the end of that story is, well, Jesus may have said, "Get me out of here," but the truth of the matter is that the pandemic closed all of our churches. And so basically, for the last couple of years, we haven't been able to go into a church building to meet Jesus, that Jesus has had to come out of the church buildings, and we've had to meet God anew in these very difficult circumstances that we never imagined ourselves being in. So that's the big parentheses at the beginning and the very end. But then inside of that, there's a second parenthesis, and that parenthesis it begins at the very first part of chapter 1, where I am the little girl sitting in the circle in the Methodist Sunday school room, and Miss Jean, my Sunday school teacher, is telling us a story about how Jesus welcomes all the little children. And I have this powerful sense when she holds up a picture of Jesus surrounded by children. There was a little girl in the picture who looked just like me. Or at least I imagine she looked just like me. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, just like every little girl in the Holy Land did 2,000 years ago. And so she is sitting there with Jesus, and her head is on Jesus' shoulder. And when I saw that picture, it was just like, oh my gosh, I know that Jesus is my friend. And so it opens with that really warm, nostalgic vision of the Methodist Sunday school room, and feeling welcomed by God, specifically by Jesus. That part of the story closes in the very beginning of the last chapter, of the conclusion of the book. It is me sitting on a stage at the World Parliament of Religions in 2015 in Salt Lake City, Utah. And what that moment was, I had been invited to speak at the Women's pre-event of the World Parliament of Religion. And so there were 20 of us who were all invited, and we were sitting on the stage. There were about 3,000 or 4,000 people in the ballroom. I believe we were at the Marriott in Salt Lake City. And so we're sitting there, and there's this incredible opening, and there's all this music, and then all these 20 women, each one of us was given 12 minutes to tell a story out of our own faith tradition about the power of women and faith. And every person in the circle was from a different religious tradition. And so there were 2 women in that circle who were Christians. It was myself. And of course, since we were in Salt Lake City, there was a Mormon woman, and she was representing that tradition of Christianity, which of course some people have even a hard time understanding it being Christian, but I certainly don't. So anyway, so here I am in this circle, and sitting on one side of me is a Wiccan high priestess, and sitting on the other side of me is Deepak Chopra's daughter, so a Hindu woman. And just one person down from her was Malcolm X's granddaughter. And I can remember sitting in that circle, and there was something that was so powerful about it. And I felt the presence of God. I felt safe. I felt accepted. I felt welcomed. And I felt that God was there, that Jesus was there. And I can remember getting up to the microphone and giving this little testimony that I shared about the power of women to read Holy Scripture for ourselves, and how that is a very life-changing thing, how that will change the world. And so instead of being read to, like I was in the first circle in the Methodist Sunday school room, here I am on the stage in public in a circle, and I'm reading a story to all of the women there, to make them know deeply that they are all friends of God. And so those 2 circles are really the 2 circles I think that frame up my life. The Methodist Sunday school to the stage of the World Parliament of Religions. And I always, when I've talked about that in public, which I have done a little bit, I always say kudos to the Methodists, because in effect, I think that it is the most Methodist of all kinds of stories for a 20th century life. Methodism shaped me in such a way that I could move through those 6 chapters from one circle to another and feel it cohesively and consistently, and to value the experience of God with me. And so that's the book. And I wanted to point out those 2 endings, because I think that they're so important. Is that this idea of what circle do we sit in, and how does the ending connect to the beginning? And even though it's not the ending in toto, I got more to go. No announcements tonight. And the other sort of ending of the book is this experience we've all been through together as people around the globe. What is going to happen to religion post all of this, when the religious institutions that we had to rapidly adapt in new ways to be able to continue doing their work in a world that literally changed overnight. So I love it. I love the book. I've loved it more since I've gotten to talk to you all. I forgot how much I liked it when I was working on it, from the time I worked on it till now. And I feel like, in a sense, you sort of all gifted me back my own narrative as I've gotten to share it with you. And I guess the easiest way of saying it is that, Jesus has always been there, and I haven't lost things through this sort of whole ebbing and flowing of whatever these multiple quote unquote deconstructions are. I've done nothing but gain from them. And that this whole sort of process has so deeply enriched and shaped my life. And I feel more Christian than ever at the end of this all.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's that's awesome. All right. I love hanging out with you. So I have I have two questions that I want to ask. And the first one is, what transformations that you went through that were hard earned in these stories do you hope are normative, that should you become a grandparent they don't have? And which transformations, um the ones like coming back to things you had in an earlier kind of younger or more naive state, do you hope they get that struggle of having that space, growing beyond it, and then coming back to including it again? um because one of the most endearing parts of this book is your ability to find beautiful things in each of them. And like, I could imagine you saying yes to each of them and no to each of them for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So like, uh, you know, if you zoom forward 20 years and you're talking to confirmand grandchild, which of
I
these
hope
chapters
so.
do you hope they, which ones do you, which ones do you want to, those transformations to be like solidarity, sister, that kind of thing, and which ones you hope they didn't have?
Well, I think that the easiest thing is to say what I don't want them to have, and that is something I don't want anybody to ever have, is the places where the church or theology or that sort of religion, the structure of religion itself, did violence to myself, or I did violence to others, thinking I was saying or doing the right things in my own self-righteousness. That is what I regret when I participated in it, but it was so wounding as well. So that's the thing that I would hope that every human being would live a lifetime without ever having to suffer religious abuse, and without ever having to have been, have the shame of having to confess that one had abused in the name of religion. And so I want both of those things to go away completely. And as for the other, what I hope stays is that there is a tremendous line in the whole book that several people have noticed, and I know that you noticed it because we've talked about it before. Is that this is a deeply feminist book, and if you kind of don't get that, go back and look at it again, because this book takes what has been oftentimes sort of theoretical in theology about gender, and it embodies it in this robust way, and answers the question. One of the primary questions of feminist theology going back into the 1970s was, what does a male savior have to say to women? And I mean, it's a great question. Why does a woman need a male savior? And so I just come at that question with everything I've got and try to show how feminism and Christianity can be lived. And so that part of it, my only biological child, I have a stepson, but my only biological child is a daughter. And I've certainly tried to raise her with that kind of deep sort of feminist awareness of experience and of the text and of what Christianity can really mean for and to women. And she certainly, if her ability to be herself is any any indication, I think she didn't struggle with that at all. So she embraced that, and it's fantastic, because I think that some of my greatest stories, not just in this book and other books that I've written too, are all these amazing stories that I tell about the women who are in my family, who were the ones who really, they were often the ones who were most abused by religion, but they were also the ones who were heroic in passing faith on and doing it in ways that freed it from the shackles that other people tried to put on them. And so that's the two things. I wish religious abuse would go away, both having it directed at us and when we have unwittingly or hurtfully directed it to others. And I really, 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 truly dream of a world where everyone who has been on the short end of the stick, everyone who has never felt that they were fully welcome at the table, everyone who has always seemed to be a non-person, understands how much this story can mean to them, and that they have real agency and real power, and that they are writing theology with their own lives, and it matters what your life is. So that's that piece that I want everybody to take away and go, yes, it's worth it being Christian. And and I think it is. I really do.
Yeah. And in some ways, what you do in the acts of reclaiming in your kind of theologically feminist memoir style is insist that when people encounter Jesus as something less than a full affirmation of their personhood, it's sub-Christian. And a lot of times our tendency when we're dealing with pain, trauma, and hurt from a religious organization is the pain then functions to treat the violator's account of the truth as normative. And then now we're a victim of it. So then who is it that's hurting us? Biblical Christianity, true Christianity, evangelical Christianity, or whatever it is. Or say the early feminist movement, Mary Daly, who you quoted on the, what do we do with a male savior for feminists? Like she was rebelling against the Catholic Church. One of the things memoir feminist theology does is it decenters the violator's authority, but it does so by giving a rich account of the faith, as opposed to an account by negation, where you're cutting off parts. You're reclaiming it all in a different tone and going, no, listen. It's kind of like I was a youth minister for a long time. This is an aside, but I promise it comes back to what I think you're doing. This is ultimately a Diana Butler Bass compliment. Okay, so I was a youth minister for a long time, and all of a sudden, like when I was finishing being youth minister in Los Angeles, like 5 or 6 years ago, all of a sudden youth started wearing T-shirts of bands that I grew up listening to when I was a teenager, right? So they have like a Stone Temple Pilots T-shirt or a Nirvana T-shirt, and they wear them. And they might know one song, right? I would ask them, like, you have a Nirvana T-shirt? I was like, which is your favorite album? And this kind of thing.
What's an album?
Yeah, they were like, I have a few of their songs on my Spotify playlist, and you get that like moment, but like in their mind, they're like putting on the shirt, and this means rock music, right? And then you listen to what they called rock, and you're like, that's neat. And then you're like, but have you turned up Nirvana's Bleach album at a loud volume before? Because it's a really different experience. And underneath it, right, like they get this nostalgia of like, oh, I'm inheriting this thing, like this story of rebellious rock music in America. And yet they might know a song or two, but they don't know. And then all of a sudden you're like, no, listen to Bleach loud. Like, you haven't listened all the way through, like Pearl Jam, Alive, at a loud volume. Like, this is nuts. And then they experience it, and like, oh, Junk Trip, this is amazing. You're like, exactly. We haven't even got to Rage Against the Machine yet, and underneath that, right, you're not there's one to be like, oh, you're telling you're wrong, or only this part's right. It's different to go like, I'm retelling it and then going like, when I retell it, I'm going to include even more of what's there. And that's one of the things memoirs allow, is that you are the expert of your story. And when you heal and process and grow, then you get to retell your story in a new way, where you're the author of the meaning in it, and someone else isn't telling you what God's agenda was in it.
Right.
And you perform that in the book beautifully. I just, as the theologian who has a hard time being that forward about their own story, I was jealous, and I think it's awesome. And that's why I think a lot of people, like on Twitter or Instagram, like throw up their like nostalgia shirts or whatever. And your invitation is like, yeah, but don't let them just like cut your playlist down to nothing.
Yeah.
Like
right.
reclaim the whole thing. It can be life-giving again. They can't steal that junk.
Yeah.
Because God gave it to you. Like they don't, you know.
But, and the funniest thing, in the longer term, and I think that our class will be interested in this, is that as the book is now a year old, and I've had so many conversations about it, there's been this one particular thread of conversation where certain people were mad at me for being nice to evangelicals. And I guess my piece today on Substack made up for that. But what I think that both of those pieces show, it's like, on one hand, I'm doing exactly what you said, is that I'm not letting a certain group of evangelicals tell my story about who I was as an evangelical. I'm actually taking my story back from them and saying, this is what mattered to me. And this is how I understood what it meant to be evangelical. And this is how I understood myself in relationship to this theology when I was 15 or when I was 22 or when I was, as late as being about 25 or 27. And so that was there is a way in Freeing Jesus that I am so much more sympathetic to evangelicalism than in anything else I've ever written. And it's because I'm telling it from my point of view and why it matters to me, why it mattered and what mattered to me. And then there's this other story as well. And I can move in and out of both of those stories. One is when I'm doing memoir. One is when I'm telling the story and claiming its power for myself. The other one is when I'm enacting part of my vocation, and that is being a historian, a person who has done a lot of opinion writing, a lot of journalism, working out as a, sort of a theologian, really as a theologian's voice. And that voice involves critique. And so when I'm over there doing that work, which is all the same, it's the same Diana, I'm just sort of functioning out of different parts of my vocation and my experience. I'm actually critiquing the group that has centered themselves as evangelicals. So on one hand, I'm talking about I'm decentering evangelicals and I'm reclaiming my own evangelical experience. And I'm lifting that up and saying, hey, isn't this beautiful? If you had this experience, hey, that was great. As a matter of fact, I even do that in the piece today at Substack. I talk about evangelicalism, just very briefly. It's like, 4 sentences, evangelicalism in California in the 70s, and some of the ways that I talked about them here in our class. And I mentioned this evangelical rock and roll in the 70s and its roots in the counterculture and how different that is from praise music later on. And so that little sentence got a huge amount of attention on Twitter, especially from Christian Coves Dumais, who picked it up and ran with it and linked me into a very long conversation on Twitter about that. And so in that case, I'm warm towards evangelicalism, but then you can read the Substack piece and say, oh my gosh, this woman, she's so mean to evangelicals. No, I'm not being mean. I'm providing a critique of the dominant voice of white American evangelicalism and the harm it's done to our political environment over the last 40 years. And both of those things are true. And that people can't figure that out really perplexes me. that on one hand, and I can do that with pretty much anything. I can do that with the Episcopal Church. I can talk on one hand about the beauty of its liturgy and how much I love it. And then on the other hand, I can tell you all the things to critique about the Episcopal liturgy, how it's hierarchical and it puts out atonement theology that I don't like, and that it is the sort of the ecclesial remnant of British imperialism from the 19th century. So it doesn't mean that I'm being mean to the Episcopal Church. It means I'm being honest about the Episcopal Church's history and theology and how it has perpetuated, in some circumstances, harm. And yet, on the other hand, it's also given the world a lot of beauty and freedom. And so that we can recognize all of that about religion, I think, is part of the process of really, at least it was for me, really growing in faith. And to be able to embrace both the voice of critique and the voice of deep, profound acceptance, and have them be springing from the very same heart, and just sort of functioning in different ways in the world, depending upon which situation is called for.
You sharing that makes me think of the conversation which everyone in the group got today, with Helen Bond, who's head of school here at the University of Edinburgh, though I guess I'm in Paris, so it's not here now. But she's a feminist New Testament scholar. And her newest book, Women Remembered, Jesus' Disciples, we talk about it in the second half. And I brought up a bunch of questions that people in the group asked around patriarchy, feminism, and Jesus and stuff. And one of the things that she does in that book that's real similar to what you're doing, in the use of memoir. Now, a lot of times we tell stories and we tell them filtered through the dominant ideology. And the Gospels are not, they don't escape their historicity in the sense of they're fully human, just like Jesus. And the church, who canonize texts and interpret them, don't. And so this book, The Women Remembered, is looking at taking all we know in the history and then the little bits you get of different figures, and then going like, what could we tell, knowing that their stories are always being told where this patriarchal ideology is at work. Like, what's going on underneath it? And what you discover, right, is that Jesus was affirming of women in ways that were rather radical in his own context, that Paul recognized the authority of women and all these kind, like, there's all this stuff going on, and yet the filters are always at play. And I think one of our moments right now is that we're at a space, for lots of reasons that could be a whole class worth, is that as a species and as a faith tradition, we need to move beyond going, how do we resist a patriarchal filter? How do we get a little more inclusive? How do we blah, 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 blah? And how do we ultimately get to a space where the dignity of each individual is recognized as something that needs to be included on their own terms in their encounter with God, and as Christians in Christ, as the beginning space for telling the gospel. And that's why I love the memoir work you do, is because you're in some sense reclaiming your own story from those who wanted to give it to you. And what Helen is trying to do there is to reclaim the story that the tradition didn't let creep out, right? Like, Paul is ordaining and sending out women to do all sorts of stuff, sending the literal letter of Romans to people he's never met to read it and interpret it on his behalf. Jesus, they go through all that stuff. And then a few centuries later, they're like, wow, man, I guess we could let them be nuns.
Right.
Their vocation's making babies.
Right.
And you're like, anyway, so I think the memoir thing's really important. And there's like I was talking with one of my former youth who's in the class, and she's 23. I didn't ask her if I could tell a story, so I'm gonna be vague. But plenty of people have messaged in hear this as like, I get to reclaim my story as well. She
Mhm.
heard it as, I don't have to reclaim mine because I still have mine. And that's a different move, right? That there's a difference in the reclaiming, and the other is the agency you're modeling is something I'm never giving up. Why? Because Jesus freed me, and because of the freeing of Jesus, like I don't have
Wow.
to give up that again. And that's such a like, anyway, I was like, I wish you'd said something about that about me. I mean, I was your minister for like 6 years. But anyway, okay, here's here's my second question.
Oh
Um,
no. Oh, yeah, I was gonna say you should talk about your book, but
no, but you're
I'll go
gonna
with what
answer
I
my,
can.
this is my favorite question, my
Okay.
favorite topic. At some point, I want to get a book contract to write a book on friendship. I've been tracking philosophers and anytime I read anything about friendship, I want to write a book on friendship. I think friendship is central to the mission of God,
I
all
do
that kind
too.
of stuff. Um, so here, this is Tripp's question for Diane at the end. You, at the end of the book, you use the language friend of God a number of times. You even use it earlier today. Throughout the book, you talk about individuals who are friends in your story. One, thinking of all of us who've been in this journey, going through Lent, going to Easter, one of the things we get the opportunity to rise to after Easter are in the relationships that were already present. What kind of wisdom do you have for those of us that seek to be friends of God to let that friendship inspire our friending in our lives? It's really vague,
Wow.
but you have multiple friends in the story. Friendship of God's an overarching thing. And as someone who's experienced all these different moments and transitions, what kind of wisdom do you have for us to, in a sense, practice resurrection in our friendships?
I think that question, just experientially actually works the opposite way for me. I confessed here before all the community of saints and God together. I sometimes haven't been very good at friendship in my own life. I rue a good number of broken relationships that I feel are stringing behind me. And if I could go back and fix some of those, and behave differently and say something different and recognize my own brokenness at a certain moment in time and apologize for things, boy, I really could. And there are some that I've actually tried to do that with, and I'm clumsy at it at best. So I think that for me, the experiential piece actually works the opposite way, is that the brokenness that I feel like I've experienced with far too many friendships has made me run toward this idea of being a friend of God, because there's something there that has got to be better than the way that I've managed to mess it up through my lifetime. And so what I kind of hope in relationship to your question, putting it in sort of the Easter language there, is that a fulsome understanding of the friendship of God that makes itself known at the table on Maundy, Thursday, the friendship that I certainly have felt with Jesus the whole way through, the friendship that emerges, I think, after the resurrection, when Christ breathes on the disciples, breathes on his friends in the upper room after in that resurrection appearance. I think that becomes the sort of the locus for um, imagining that a different set of human relations are possible, and that even when it comes to friendship, which seems in a sense the simplest and most joyful of all kinds of human relationships, that those are always fraught with our own inadequacies, our brokennesses, and the places where we sin. And to think that the God of the resurrection is breathing life on those relationships as part of the whole story in the Easter account, starting with Maundy, Thursday, and stretching through the Easter Sunday night. and even through the resurrection appearances, like when Peter jumps out of the boat naked and runs towards Jesus, he's running to, see his friend on the beach. I just think that becomes a vision to press on, even when friendship fails, and to try to model and be a different kind of human in relationship to others.
I think that's pretty, but I like you.
Well, it's hard, because I know that there are a couple of friends of mine on on the chat, and it's like, I better be as honest here as I can be, because otherwise they're going to really call me to account. Which is one of the great things about friendship and community, is when somebody that for a really long time is present in a community, there is a kind of honesty it holds you to. And I think that also works sort of on that sacred level too, is if you think about God being your friend, there is the warmth, and there is the acceptance and welcome and all of those things, that a God who listens, a God who is with you. But there's also a place of accountability, because it's a God, your friends know you, and you can't get away with stuff. So it's a twist on the old evangelical hanging a movie camera in front of you your whole life. I don't know, that might have been before your time, but when I was a teenager in evangelicalism, there was this idea that God was up in heaven with a movie camera taping our whole lives, and was going to show it to us after our deaths, because God knew everything, and then God would take the film and burn it. God, the great movie director.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like Elf on a Shelf, but worse.
I was bad. Oh, look, somebody said they've heard that sermon. Oh. It was a real thing. So, but our friends, they actually really do model that in a way that's so loving. The friendships you manage to keep are all about usually grace and forgiveness. And those friendships, they hold things for you. They hold the right secrets in the right way, so that you can feel free. And that is just I think that's one of the beautiful things about friendship.
Awesome. Okay, so all right, so I'm gonna be short, but there were a bunch of questions people sent in that were related to atonement, pain, trauma, and stuff that connects a part of what is at the end of the book. So I thought I'd say something about that. Diana can respond, and then we'll go through questions until we run out of time. So my thought is to give 2 images, and then I'll give just my 5 rules for thinking about atonement theology that doesn't suck, and I'll just state them. Then Diana and I can talk about them in whatever ways we want.
I'm gonna get a pencil and a paper and write things down while you're talking.
All right, so 2 images. One is a transferable nightmare. There were lots of questions that came in about the cross, and then what you do with the cross and resurrection if you aren't on team penal substitutionary atonement, which I'm not. Me and the early church, we aren't on that team. And in one of the stories that has helped me make sense of how to see the cross, it's inspired by the Cappadocians, like the people that invented the Trinity that became Orthodox, who thought that what redeemed the world wasn't the cross, it wasn't the resurrection, it was the incarnation. The incarnation redeems the world. That was a saving event. Why? Because that's when God gives God's self to the world. That's when the infinite becomes finite. That's when God's self-investment in the world is fully received by something finite, right? So when we say God, that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, something like that, what we really mean, if you're a Cappadocian, is that the finiteness of Jesus's materiality as flesh participates fully with the divinity of God. And in that moment, it opens up all of finite existence to the life of God. Theosis is the language they use, becoming divine, like that you are God's. I mean, that's literally Ephesians. Anyway, you're becoming a God. Not like God with a G-O-D in capital, but you're becoming divine. Now, what is the cross? The cross is a revelation of our brokenness. It's a revelation of the injustice, pain, suffering, and things we bring into the world. The cross is a mirror of who we are, honestly. The resurrection's an affirmation of God's insistence of grace and possibility, and insistence that the incarnation that gives God's self to the world is given again on the other side of our honest assessment of our brokenness. And here's the story that helps this make sense to me. Scrooge. You all know Scrooge, right? Horrible. Like, and that is like, he's horrible even if you aren't a Marxist. But if you are, he's even worse. Okay, so what does Scrooge do? Selfish little twat. He's just like not a good guy. He not even caring about Tiny Tim. What kind of man is this Scrooge guy? Right? And then what happens? Goes to bed. He gets visited by 3 ghosts. First one, the ghost of Christmas past. Shows him, here is the death you have dealt in your life. The consequences of your sin is this death. The impoverishment and pain, the way he overworked and extended people's lives so they weren't able to be present. Like, just go through that list. And then he's haunted again, the ghost of Christmas present. And he goes, look at the world you're building right now, Scrooge. These are the consequences of your sin. Look at the people you say you care for and the effects. And then he's haunted again, the ghost of Christmas future. And it shows him his life, and he dies a cold, rich, lonely man. And no one cares. And he falls into his own grave. And then what happens? Scrooge wakes up. And having seen the nightmare of what he's did, what he's doing, and what he will do under the curse of death, or if you're Paul, sin, law, and death, he rises to new life. And what does he do? He chooses to participate with a different vision of the world, a different reality of the world. The cross can function just like that haunting for those of us that really are the agents of pain and suffering and cross building in a world. Think structural situations. It can be a nightmare for those of us that are violators, that twist things in our personal lives. It can be a nightmare, but it's the right kind of nightmare. The cross is a transferable nightmare to us in our own situation, just like Scrooge, who's faced with the consequences of the crosses, real and metaphorical, you and we are building. And what does the cross give? The truth about the past, an awareness of what we're engaged in on the present. And then in seeing the future, if we don't change, it offers the possibility of metanoia. That is a picture of atonement, of the cross, that I find perfectly compelling. And it's to me, it's compelling at the personal level and at the systemic level. And it's really good news for us in each place that we, like Scrooge, are agents of violation, that we're the one that causes pain and suffering to the victim. And yet, if, you can imagine the whole sermon of this, right? And then I'm like, oh, if we were at a youth camp, come down front for our transferable nightmare excitement.
Damn, that's really good. I love it.
But if you did that, right, that's half the story, right? In some sense, that's reframing the shitty vision Billy Graham gave us, right? Like the Billy Graham crusade gets up and the whole thing's built to help everyone know that they've done something wrong. And then what's the consequences of this wrong? A dad with some anger issues. I mean, forgiveness of sin, like, that whole story of kind of crappy penal substitutionary atonement, rather shallow, like once saved, always saved, God kind of stuff, is all built around the sinner. And here's what I heard in so many questions. What about the sinned against? What about the one that was the victim? What about the one that carries shame? And here's the thing, scripture actually has an entire story built in it for the sinned against, for those that bear pain and shame. And that's the other side of the story that I think is important. The story of the transferable nightmare is about you, like the centurion, recognizing and awaking to the fact in your present moment, what you've done, what you're doing, and then a new life you could have. And that's a real different story than someone who has no power and agency looking under the cross at the one that told them they mattered, the one that told them that Abba knew their name, knew their face, and cares. And now he's dying and did not deserve it. In that space, that's where the cross of Jesus is an identification, an event of solidarity with all those that bear crosses in this world, real and metaphorical. And in that way, the cross of Jesus is not just a brother, in a sense, in your suffering and pain. The cross is in the heart of God. That, one, that's like the biggest perk of preserving some kind of Trinitarian thought, is that then the cross is in the very heart of God. Not only does Jesus experience abandonment, suffering, and pain, but the Father knows what it's like to be stuck watching it, unable to do anything. But here I think is the essential part of it. It's not just, and there were a number of people that pointed this out, like Tripp, yeah, we know you process people. You're always down for the fellow sufferer who understands, like God experiences with it, but what does God do with it? And this is, I think, what the incarnation as the atoning event, as the redemptive event, says when we speak resurrection. The resurrection is God's insistence that God's own self-giving into the world will not be deterred. But it's not deterred because God's omnipotent, because God overthrows our agency. God is the infinite God of love who insists and persists in luring and calling us into the divine life that God has created for us, but never determines it and forces it. And so the resurrection is the perfect symbol for the infinite God of love who said, I choose you, creation. I choose you, neighbor. I choose you, enemy. I choose you, victim, violated, excluded, shamed. Resurrection is God's insistence that the world has been chosen, and then God's refused to be God without us. And that each cross is a space where God gives God's self again until the world receives God and gives itself back. And then you say, Tripp, what does that look like? That's literally what we mean when we talk about the incarnation. What do we mean? That must sound biblical. What is Jesus? The image of the invisible God. He is what finite world looks like when it says yes to God completely. Did that mean that Jesus is some magical intervention that breaks like scientific naturalism and now we have to have arguments with apologists? No. What it means is that Jesus understood his identity before God and knew what that meant for how he related to his neighbors and his enemies. And he said yes to God, even if it meant the cross. And you say, whoa, Tripp, where are you getting this from? Is this crazy, wacko, liberal bullshit? No, I'm getting it from Philippians chapter 2. This is one of the oldest things in the New Testament. Paul quotes it in like the year 48 because he knows everyone knows it. That let the same mind be in you, the church in Philippi, that was in Christ Jesus, who did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of a servant. Where? Even to death on a cross. Why did Jesus perform this faithfulness that went all the way to the end? So that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess to the glory of God the Father. And you go, well, Tripp, that sounds like some imperialistic that sounds, you're going back to Billy Graham stuff, right? No, I'm going to tell you that what I just said is what Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Nazianzus, the people who invented the Trinity, all thought this meant. Here's what they meant. They said the God of love could never force anyone to bow the knee. That's less than love. Origen, early 3rd century, said this was part of the apostolic teaching that God is love and love can never coerce. So what does it mean then that all bow their knee? It means that the image of God in Jesus is so compelling that they choose to acknowledge that the one that made them and knows them and loves them completely has chose them in their brokenness and redeemed them. So the bowing of the knee is not an act of coercion where they learn which side of the eschaton they're on, hell or heaven. The bowing of the knee is an image of what the world's like when sin, law, and death is conquered. Tripp, this sounds like this universalist BS again. Where are you sneaking this in? 1 Corinthians 15. You know that? The biggest resurrection passage in the New Testament? Where Paul goes, like, this, all things become subject to the Son, sin, law, and death in the resurrection. Why? So that God may be all in all. Not like, what does that mean? So that all things in their full identity are understood to participate in the divine life. What is it that we are all created for, intended for, and will be redeemed for? Participation in the divine life. I think, and this is just Tripp, that if you talk about the incarnation, the death and resurrection, if you talk about the life ministry, what Jesus said, did, and endured, that whole thing, if you attach it to God, is, if Jesus is right, if God is Abba, and God has a dream for the world, it's one where all of the world comes to understand itself as God sees it. And its source is Abba. The one that pursues it is Abba. And where it ultimately resides is in the divine life. And nothing I've said wasn't said in the first 3 centuries of the church. I just want you to know this is like a clear live option in early Christianity. Now, there's a process version of it that I write a large book about that you can go get. But here are the 5 rules. I'm going to say them quickly because these, I think, will helpful for you to go. When you, so many of you told these stories of like, why when my family says this or my pastor says this, do I get creeped out? So I came up with 5 things when they talk about atonement, cross, resurrection stuff. These are just rules that go through. Number 1, if people draw a distinction between justification and sanctification, they're missing the point. At no point in Jesus's ministry does he draw that distinction. In fact, he forgives people's sins before he even died on the cross, which complicates the whole story. Yep. And he calls people perfect that clearly aren't. Right? Now, you may say, Tripp, you sound like a Wesleyan. That's probably because he was more accurate in this moment. But drawing a distinction between justification and sanctification in some ways evacuates God from certain moments until God intervenes. And the picture of the God-world relationship Jesus gives is one in which God is where we live, move, and have our being. Anyway, second one, there should never be a contradiction between the character of God and the character of Jesus.
Oh,
God should
amen.
at least,
everybody should have that on a sign in their office.
in the book, I joke at the end of the book, like there's only one absolutist rule I have for theology, and it's that God should at least be as nice as Jesus.
I know. I love that. I love that line. It shows that you quoted yourself all the time on it, and it's exactly right.
And but here's why that's important. So many atonement theories gone wrong treat the cross as if God the Father has this one thing, holy wrath, and God the Son has this other. Anytime there's a
He's
disconnect,
so sweet.
anytime you get those, just go no basket.
Yeah.
Third, if you give an account of salvation that's only about human beings, it hasn't recognized that the incarnation was all for all material existence. That God created all things, not just human beings. So salvation that's not expanded to creation is not good enough. This is true for ecological questions. It's true for like how we understand new creation without evacuation of souls and Gnostic kind of redeemer myths. But there's tons of reasons to have that third rule. Fourth, salvation is for the sinner and the sinned against. You should be able to tell a story that's good for those that are the violator and the victim. And if you don't have one that's for both, then it will never break the cycle where they keep making each other. At the very heart of this breaking of the cycle is that the resurrection comes after the cross, not another line of crosses. This is something John Dominic Crossan made a big point in his book, Render Unto Caesar, that we talk about. Those of you that are in the cottage group, we'll talk about soon. And you all have an opportunity in a couple of weeks to talk with him. But the sinner and the sinned against, salvation's for both. If it's not for both,
really good
it's
interview you did with him.
I'm glad you liked it, Diana.
I did. I loved
it. And the last one is salvation that is relational, includes the whole web of relations. And that means we can't just think about individuals. It means we have to think about society. We have to think about structures and institutions. We have to think about our ecological situation in the cosmos. Oftentimes, when we talk about salvation, because the shitty version that is cooperates with patriarchy, hierarchy, nationalism, exclusivism, and all these other kind of isms that make the place God acts on individual souls, not even their whole body, let alone their whole person, then salvation becomes this debate about this little bit. If you get kind of what I'm saying, like if salvation has this whole thick relational sense, then it includes the whole web of relations, because you are not you without all the relations. And hashtag process party, God's not God without the whole web of relations. So anyway, the image, transferable nightmare, heart, the cross in the heart of God. And then 5 rules: no clear distinction between justification and sanctification, no contradiction between the character of God and Jesus, salvation expanded to include creation, salvation's for the sinner and the sinned against, and salvation, this relational, includes the whole web of relations. That's like the cliff notes to the last chapter and the 2 atonement chapters of my other book that y'all had lots of questions about. So
it. That was amazing. So you know what I want, Tripp? I want something like tulip, so because you gave us 5 points and I need a flower. And see, look, somebody just said that. Oh my God, we need a flower. That's exactly what I was thinking. So I want, that's your homework from me, is you have to come up with a flower. I don't know if it's iris. Well, that's 4, daisy, roses, something, pansy.
I think pansy would be would be the most fun just because it'd be so triggering to Calvinists.
I know it'd be great.
Skunk, cabbage. Someone just said skunk. Lilac. Okay.
Lilac, yeah. See, so you need a flower to go right up against tulip. But boy, thank you. That was one thing that while you were going through all that, I just took a bunch of notes. But you reminded me why and how I like theology is to be able to sort of pull out these pieces and then reassemble them in a way that makes the story come to life. And I thought that the transferable nightmare, and that was just great. And to be able to talk about that with such a great analogy with Scrooge, but also the asking the two questions. What about this when you're the sinner, what about the people who are sinned against? And one of the things I think is really interesting about that, of course, is that so often we change places in that story. And I just talked about that, as with friendship, is that sometimes I was the person who needed the friend, but other times I was the person who violated my friends. And so as human beings, we actually move around in the analysis that you just gave us. Is that sometimes when we come to the cross, we're staying there with the Scrooge story, and we need that part of it. We need to be haunted by the cross. And then other times when we come to the story of Easter, the story of Good Friday, we're coming as the person sinned against. We're coming as the non-person. And then we need not the sin, law, and death piece, but instead we need to understand how sin, law, and death have isolated us, have turned us into victims, and that in that moment when we feel like everything is ending, we have solidarity with God, and that we go into the heart of God. And so I think that was really interesting as you were talking about that. I heard both of those things so strongly. And then there's this human mistake where we'll just identify with one. And the truth of, I think, your analysis is that it opens the possibility for us to have a full life, where we know that sometimes we're one and sometimes we're the other. So is that purposeful, do you think, in the way that you structured those two things, or
Yeah,
just sort of arises out of it?
No, it was definitely purposeful. And well, I'll give the not long version of it, but like, I mean, I'm a Baptist preacher's kid from the South. It's like a straight white dude who has a high enough IQ to be good at a lot of things. I'm an extrovert, which is outgoing and privileged in our very patriarchal inheritance of our culture. I recognize all those things, which means I assume a lot of my intuitions. I normalize things violators normalize and treat as normal. And yet there are little parts of my story and things that are different. Like, I'm a large guy. I've been picked on my whole life about my size. And like, I can have under 1,800 calories a day and exercise 40 minutes, 6 days a week, and barely lose any weight. And still be acting like I'm just lazy. Which half the time I am lazy because there's not a lot of difference between the two. So it's like, it wasn't like a defense thing. I have learning disabilities where in the academy, the fact that I'm dyslexic has certain limitations. Like when we give guild papers, I don't read mine. Why? Because I read like a dyslexic. I skip lines.
And people kind of go, what's he saying?
Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm saying either. I was so stressed out about reading. So I memorize things because I was a theater major, and I'll do chunks. And it's basically like memorize chunks and do improv between it. And but also when I was, and this is a vulnerable story in case someone is, when I was young, I was violated by a friend who learned it from their parent. And I didn't feel like I could share it in Southern purity culture.
Mhm.
Even the people that later were like, why didn't you tell me? Because I love you. And so I internalized lots of shame around that. And regardless of what, however I saw the other stuff, that was the main thing that shaped so much of my life experience. Right. And so in all those things, like I, for years, spent, if the only story of salvation you have is for the sinner, then I had to fit the feelings I had about being a victim into the narrative of the sinner in
Mhm.
order to feel God's presence in it. And it felt gross, and I tried so hard. And why I shared a lot of that was because individuals in this group shared stories with me that made me realize just how much that's impacted and shaped me. And if you don't have a story for both, then if you're me and you really care about your faith, and in plenty parts of your life it's life-giving, you now have to work how to convince yourself that you were the sinner when you were the victim.
Right.
And you have to believe it in order to really receive God's forgiveness. That is just sick. And it took a lot of work for me to get over that. And yet that whole time, I still am a straight white guy with a high IQ and lots of benefits and privilege. Right. And so I knew I was dealing with both.
Mhm.
And so much of that actually led me to Korean liberationist theologians who in Korean thought they have this concept of Han. It's kind of like a wound, metaphorically, a soul wound that's open. And like once you've been wounded so much, you have this wound of Han, it's open. All sorts of things happen with an open wound, right? It gets
Right.
infected easier. It leads you
Right.
to be defensive and all, like it leads to all psycho because you have an open wound. But the solution for an open wound is not treating the symptoms, defensiveness, protectiveness, or an infection, or all that kind of thing. Like you need to fix the wound,
Right.
right? And generation upon generation, people that carry shame have these outputs from shame. And if the only thing you can do with the wound is go, what can I be guilty? It's the output of the shame. I get forgiven for this, 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 this. But really, what you need is not forgiveness. You need healing.
Right.
You need someone to go like, you are not the problem. Like when someone took advantage and hurt you, like you were not at fault. And Billy Graham knows how to tell the story for the dad that taught my friend this was reasonable. You know, that's, I was 7. Like that's like, and yet the gospel should be for both.
Right.
I hope that whatever led up to someone harming their own child, I hope that there's some kind of reconciliation and healing that happens for the kid, and that the parent can become a different person. Because I don't think deep down parents don't come in doing that. They were probably harmed too, right? So there's these cycle of shame that lead to harm. But if the only story we have is guilt, then what do? We're treating what happens when the open wound's there. We aren't treating the wound.
Right.
And the gospel's for both. And
You know,
and this is one of the things John Dominic Cross in the interview and in his big resurrection book, he emphasizes like the imagery in the early church and the mystics throughout its history. The resurrected Jesus has wounds.
right.
And I just think we have to tell the gospel for both. If you only tell it for one, even if it was just for the victim, then it doesn't break a cycle. Anyway, sorry, that was a long detour.
No, it's a really important detour, though, especially in the context of wanting to of us talking about Jesus, because it gets back to some of this other stuff that complicates how we see the purpose and the actions of Jesus' own life. So, the idea, if you believe in original sin that's passed down when Adam and Eve have sex, and that sin is in our DNA, that leads to one view of Jesus. And that's a view of Jesus that so many people in this class have been trying to get rid of, or at least try to shake the traumatic aspects of it. But if you believe in some other view of sin, and you and I share this, we believe that there's sin, there's a lot of it, there's tons of evil. We're not optimists about like human nature in that regard. We don't think people are completely good and nice and all that kind of thing. But what we don't think, we also think that people are human, and that God created the world, God created everything good, and that human beings are declared in Genesis very good. So the goodness, the beauty, the salvific power of creation, and God's image with and through us, all of that remains. But so why are we not good like God is good? Well, it's because of all this other stuff. It's because we live in this incredibly corrupted, polluted environment where people have made these hideously bad choices over and over and over again, and we've had to live in the consequence of those choices, and those consequences then shape the next generation, that shapes the next generation, etc. And I certainly have written in this book and in my last book about being abused, as a teenager, and one of the things that I don't share because I just haven't had a chance to write about it is the fact that I, like so many of us have done, I did some of those ancestry tests, and doing ancestry tests it took me on a journey where there was a bug that was crawling on my desk, where I actually am one of those people who discovered a whole family that I didn't know that I had. Lo and behold, my grandmother, who I thought had one sister for my whole life, my grandmother died in 1985. This is my mom's mom. She actually had two sisters, and she was estranged from one of her sisters. And I had no idea that there was this sister and that I had all these cousins until I took this ancestry test. And all of a sudden, all these people showed up on my ancestry results. I had no idea who they were. They all had the same last, they were all named Williams. I was like, wait a second, my maiden name was Hochstead. What's Williams? That's like, some Welsh name or something. I don't get it. And so I just thought it was like wrong until I met them. And lo and behold, they are the offspring of this broken relationship between my grandmother and her youngest sister. And when I talked to my cousins that I met for the very first time, what did I discover? But I discovered that there is an entire system, a systemic history of abuse in our family, where all of these different people had turned into abusers and then had abused all of these different women in my family, none of whom knew one another, because we were all cut off from each other by virtue of this fight that my grandmother had with her sister all these years before. But here we were literally living in the same family system of sin and evil and violence. And yet for years, I carried that around and thought it was my fault, which is basically the same thing you're saying. You have to put yourself into the story of the theology. What did I do here that caused this person to treat me in this terrible way? Did I tempt him? Am I like Eve? Did I accidentally lead that person on? All of the terrible things you think about yourself, because you're putting yourself into a story about original sin, about, and in my case, about women and temptation and all of the things that we have inherited. And so, no, somewhere, some place back in history, somebody started a story of sexual violence within my family structure. And that's all of the consequences for that person, whoever that person was, unknown still to all of us. But whoever that person was, whatever that person suffered, the consequences that was reaped in their life just passed through all these generations like a red algae tide. And so that to me is a how I understand sin to work. And so what I know from that is what we've been talking about, is that in this story that you're telling, this Jesus story that you're telling, beautiful theological story, depending upon where we are vis-a-vis that pollution, we are either the sinner, we pass that on in some way, shape, or form, or we're the victim of it. And we might move around in that environment and do different things at different times. But the real need is for healing. And that is the point.
Yeah.
Of all those images of Jesus that I presented. Sometimes people have said, well, why don't you present the great physician? And it's like, well, I kind of think that's the one that's underneath all of them, because our friends heal, our teachers are healers. I think that's the primary mission of a teacher, actually, is to be a healer. A savior, that's the closest we come to healer, because that word actually comes from healing. The idea of the Lord who sits in the circle constitutes the table rather than the Lord above. That's a healing image, etc. So actually healing runs through the whole thing, even though I don't overtly say it. But that is the need. That's what we all long for.
Yeah. I really like how you put things, Diana. I mean, I feel like I'm glad we're hanging out. So we have a little bit of time left.
Mm-hmm.
How many questions do you want to do?
Let's just go with it and see. And let's see if we can get to as many as we can in as briefly as we can.
All right.
Because I feel like I want to answer folks' concerns.
Okay. The first one is we just did a group on both of y'all's books. As you were going through each other's books again, or your own books again, what stuck out that you didn't anticipate sticking out?
Oh my goodness, that's hard to say. Do you go first?
Okay. Well, the first thing that stuck out were the stories I forgot, because you wrote yours 2 years ago when it came out a year ago.
Right.
Mine came out 5 years ago, so I wrote it a while ago, and I laughed quite hard about the story about, and I remember his face, the surfer who was trying to make room in his heart for Jesus, and I laughed at that, and I completely forgot that story altogether. The story in it about the secular atheist Jewish girl who interviewed me about Christianity because it was the religion she didn't like that much for her religion class. I forgot about that altogether, and I went looking back, and I emailed her and was like, "Oh, we were just doing this class. I reread this. I forgot. Like, what are you up to?" She's in law school anyway. But the other thing that struck, and this is for in the last chapter, was in the last chapter I talked about teaching confirmation and what it's like. My decision, the two decisions I made in confirmation class was I had them come up with their God questions every week. We had a big fishbowl called the Big God Bowl, and I never answered them for the whole year. And they eventually realized that I make them come up with a God question every week, but I always ran out of time and didn't answer it. Which is funny because they assumed I'd want to, because I'm a theologian.
Right.
And I was like, this is when I was doing my PhD and writing my dissertation.
You just
And
wanted
the
the
other part-
questions.
Yeah, I was ready to. They're like, we know you have whole podcast episodes about this, and the other bit about that was like doing that and letting them come up with experiments and taking the teachings of Jesus seriously. And being in lockdown, not because of everything we got here, we never got to be a part of a community where our family felt at home or anything. So we're like looking forward to moving back and finding like a church we actually want to be a part of and can and stuff. It's amazing to me how reading that made me go, my confidence in the gospel so connected to having 10 confirmation classes that spend a year just agreeing we're going to try out the teachings of Jesus. And they don't decide till the end of the year if they want to be a disciple and get confirmed. But for the year, we're experimenting in truth, doing the teachings. And because of that, I have a lot of confidence, which is unrelated to my intellectual confidence that may or may not be good at any moment. But the experiential confidence was, we texted a group of people every time we judged someone, and we all prayed for each other.
Wow.
And like we did they picked do not judge as the verse, do experiment. So every time in the month, if we judge someone, text a name, and I would pray like, oh God, you made, if I judge Diana, and I text everyone, God, you made and know and love Diana completely. Give Tripp the eyes to see Diana as you see her, and the courage to love her as you intend her be loved. And that's it. That's all you agree to. But all we, in the text group, you just put the name or initials if people might know, or you make a name up, whatever.
Right.
At some point, people in the group text their own name. So like if, third week we're into this and I text Tripp, and they're like, this is weird. God, you made, know, and love Tripp completely. Give Tripp the eyes to see Tripp as you see him, and the courage to love him as you intend him to be loved. Right. And then you get back in a group and process that. And then everyone realizes, like, do not judge. It's connected to the fact that all of us run around anxious and fearful that we don't even matter and belong. And the whole way of Jesus is what? An experiment in what kind of truth? That God that made you knows you completely and loves you completely. And it's above your pay grade to disagree. Right. And that just changes everything. And there were lots of things that we did in those experiments. And I go, and I had that. So like I'm sitting there thinking about like working on a very boring, nerdy book that 10 people might read about science and religion. But what's animating it is like, well, I've already tasted this. Like, this is possible. And I want more people to like encounter this. And I didn't realize till rereading a book that was so inspired by those practices, how much I'm like coming up with footnotes to justify that being a beautiful way of being. Well, I don't even know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to say, but like that was my, anyway, sorry. That was my thought about this.
Oh gosh. I think that just sort of my answer to this question about it's how I see something different now. That was the way the question was framed.
Whatever stuck out.
Okay,
most,
what stuck
like,
out
after in coming back to it?
Yeah, I think that the thing that stuck out the most, I hope this encourages people, was the worst thing in my life led to the best thing in my life. And that's not to say that every worst thing is going to wind up with a best thing, but the short period of time in the scope of things that went between the moment I felt like I was going to sink into the earth and die, when I was getting divorced, when I was losing my job, when I felt like I was the old way, ended completely in my early 30s. It was only 2 or 3 years later that I was so happy. I mean, I literally everything changed in my life, and in that short period of time, probably about 48 months. And I went from literally the worst of everything to the happiest time of my entire life. And I just can't help but hold on to that sometimes. Now sometimes when I feel bad or whatever, I look back and I remember, what it was like to be at the end of stuff, and then to not be. And the power of really resurrection in our own lives is not just a theological theory, but it's actually a real thing. I went from Holy Saturday to Easter Sunday morning, and it was gorgeous and it's beautiful, and it made me who I am now. And really my whole future existence hinged on those 48 months. And I didn't know that when it was happening, but I know it now. And the emotions attached to it were so intense. And it's okay. And so I look back at the bad stuff differently, because I actually understand how now I know now how all that horror opened the possibility for what became just amazing. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
All right. You answer this one first.
Okay.
We just spent a lot of time talking about Jesus, and there are a number of people who ask questions basically around what Jesus are you hoping to introduce to your kids? And how do you introduce Jesus to kids where they don't have all the baggage around Jesus that you may have had?
Mm-hmm. Well, we both have a little bit of experience on that. So, I took my daughter, Richard and I happily, took our daughter to church, and we attended an Episcopal church all during her growing up. And so she met that Jesus. She also met the Jesus that we talked about just in conversation, or how we answered her questions. I still remember when the Easter, she was 2 years old, and during the Eucharist at Grace St. Luke's Church in Memphis, Tennessee, she ran down the aisle waving at every window with Jesus in it, saying, "Hi, Jesus! Hi, Jesus! Good morning, Jesus!" It was like, okay. So she's heard these stories since her birth and before she can remember anything else. And I think that as a Christian parent, that's one of the things that I wanted to do, was to give her a language and a set of stories that would be native to her, and that she would be able to do with them what she will. She had the terrible good fortune of as she got older, having so many people in our friendship group who are just amazing, that she could lean on and ask questions to. Frankly, Marcus Borg basically treated her like she was his granddaughter, and they would go out on trips, sort of in his car. Whenever I was in Portland, I'd take Emma with me, and she would just go off with Marcus, and they would go hiking and walking Marcus's dog Henry, and they would just talk and just sort of be together. And I literally had no clue, what the shape of their relationship was until this one year. We were driving home from Sunday school. It was during Advent. And Emma, I said to Emma, "What did you do in Sunday school today?" And she said, "Well, we talked about the Christmas story." And I said, "What did you talk about?" And she said, "We talked about the wise men." And I said, "Oh, you did?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "Did you know that?" She's like 7 years old, maybe 8 at the very most. No, I think she was 7. She goes, "Did you know there are Christians who think the wise men were real?" And I said, I said, what? She said, she said, yeah. She said, Marcus says that the wise men, that Matthew made up the wise men so that the Jews would understand that Jesus was king. And she said, my Sunday school teacher thinks that they were real. So here's my daughter sitting in the backseat of the car in her car seat at 7 years old, first or second grade, explaining to me the biblical criticism of the nativity narratives.
That is so funny.
So literally, so she grew up around dining room tables with like Marcus Borg and Jim Wallace and Brian McLaren and Phyllis Tickle. I mean, so these were mom's friends, and boy, they filled her head with so much stuff. She's going to be processing it for a lifetime. She refers to Dom Cross and she calls him Dog Pa because because when she was little, she met Dom and it was at Marcus's house, and Marcus had this great dog named Henry, and Emma loved Henry. And Marcus and his wife Marianne referred to Dom and Dom's wife Sarah as Dog Pa and Dogma. And so they were the dog grandparents. And so every time Emma sees a picture of Dom Crossan, she says, oh, look, Mom, it's Dog Pa. And I say, do you know that he's one of the most important New Testament theologians in the world? And she goes, well, I just always think of him as Dog Pa. So I guess for me, don't take me as an example, except for the fact that I gave her a story. I let her ask anybody any questions she wanted to, and we always made it fun. It wasn't an issue of, if you don't believe this, you're going to go to hell. It was always, oh, tell me about it. And when she then told me the story that she was hearing, we would have a conversation. And I know for a fact that that's probably exactly what was happening with all those other crazy adults who are my friends. And that she learned theology and the Bible in that way, that it's not something that you have to be afraid of, but it's actually something you can have fun with, and you can find your voice and your story within it.
That's awesome. There's so many good stories. But I would hate my nickname to be Dogma, my quick response, so we can get at least one more question, would be, for parenting, I'm in handing Jesus off better. The most helpful thing has been learning from my partner Alicia, who grew up in a much more conservative fundamentalist context where all sorts of things were expected in ways that haven't been life-giving. And because I had such a positive experience with faith, I tend to be really gung-ho and then like, why should I do this or whatnot? And the more I take her own experience seriously, the more I think I make space for each of our kids to have their own vibe and how they engage it. That's also meant me to go, which I think is a fear that I heard in a number of questions. Like, I'm not trying to tell my kid to be exactly me. I want them to know me and what matters to me. Yeah. My theory on this, and this came up with first as me as a youth minister, but then it became a thing when I became a parent, is I think, what's my like Jesus playlist? Like songs you play the most, that they play so often that if that song comes on, you're like, oh, that's Dad's favorite song, or oh, that's Tripp's favorite song. He's a youth minister. Like, oh, this, we know what's going on. Or when they say this, oh yeah. And be deliberate. like, what are the few things that I hope I repeat every time we do Jesus stuff?
Oh, that's
That
a good
they go,
question.
that they go, oh, like when Jesus comes up, Dad will have said this so many times
Hmm.
that I can't shake it. And I thought of this because of how many times as a youth minister before I moved to LA, where most people were post-religious when they became the youth group, were my youth, and they said shit, and I'm like, that's horrible. And then they'd say it again. I'm like, that's wrong. I'm like, no, that's heresy. Like, and they would just keep saying it. Why? Because they heard it all the time.
Mhm.
And so I said, I want to build the religious playlist that doesn't suck. And as a youth minister, I would help the youth council would come up with it each year. It would be playful, like our 5 rules. And they would come up with different ones, but we use them all the time. They're on the wall. But they're essentially hermeneutical tools. But for our kids, I call them like our fuller family wisdom.
Hmm.
So like, and as they get older, I tell it to them. And then there are new versions of it as they get older. So like the first one is, the most true thing about you is you're God's beloved. And Cora's at 3. Elgin, who's 4, she's 8. Elgin's at Fuller Rule 7. I haven't made up the new ones. I keep making them as to go along, and they get new ones. But one, the most true thing about you is you're God's beloved. Then what do you learn as you get older? It's also true about your neighbor.
Mhm.
Oh, it's also true about your enemy, right? Don't live in the past. Right? So what's that mean? Your mistakes were a moment. They don't define you. Then what else does it mean? God doesn't live in the past, and neither should you. Like they each, I come up with these ones they build,
Mhm.
but where my goal is, they hear me say, oh, what's number 2? Don't live in the past. What's number 1? Most true thing about you is you're God's beloved. What's number 3? Love others as you want to be treated. Like, and all of them have some teaching of Jesus in it, but they also have like different variations as they get bigger. But my goal is the things they think are most important for me to hand down are nestled in a teaching of Jesus and grow with their life. Because my goal is for them not to think Jesus is something you accomplish. Now I'm Baptist, so like, oh, you get saved or whatever. You get baptized. It's not something you accomplish. Jesus is an invitation to wisdom. And like my second favorite JC, John Cobb, says, when Christ is the center, there is no boundary. And so I want them to like grow. And so I do that. And I have found when you repeat stuff, then when they read the Bible with you, which now Elgin reads it by himself, but like Cora, she's 8, about to turn 9. We'll read something and I talk to her about it. She goes, well, one of them is God should at least be as nice as Jesus. That's just their father's material. But, like, oh, well, God should at least be as nice as Jesus. Well, the most true thing about Nicodemus is he is God's beloved. If that's the framework you read that story, then you get what he's doing. Anyway, I try to do it that way because I'm like the all-in parent, and then I have a parent, the other parent has lots of baggage and hurt. And I think honoring her experience means I have to make space for the distancing and processing she's doing. And so I've tried to figure out how can I give the full me, but also not think I have to like own the space. And is a tenuous thing, but I'm the one that does night times. I do probably 90% of the prayers at tables if kids don't do it. I started to do one at a restaurant in Paris, and Alicia's like,
everybody's going, no, Dad.
yeah. I'm like, well, it's Lent.
Oh my goodness gracious. I think that when you talk about that, the best thing, I mean, like I said, my daughter had this really kind of just singularly weird experience in certain ways growing up with a mom who's a writer, and that I have all these friends. But the simplest things we taught her are the things that just stay with her. I mean, and that really shape her. God is love. Period. Full stop, end. And if you say that over and over and over and over and over to your kid, and they eventually, I mean, she understood that really early. And so God is love. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. I mean, there were these certain kinds of verses that and pin what I would call sort of directional points of scripture that I reiterated all the time, and that I would quote, that her dad would quote. And Richard grew up as a liberal Presbyterian, so he has his own baggage. But so our directional signals, actually, my husband and I were often alike, but we would talk about our experiences with those directional signals differently. And I think Emma has had a fascination over the years about my experience in evangelicalism, and she is much more in the mode of the liberal Protestantism of her father. And that's great. That it's a great tradition, and I'm glad for that. And she understands a bit about sort of where I've been, and she kind of flirted around the edges of some evangelicalism for a while. I think it was mostly as a way to try to understand Mom. And she's just a really good person, and I feel really lucky. She actually majored in religious studies at the University of Virginia, and graduated with highest distinction from the religious studies department after she wrote a thesis on the Black social gospel, and how Rauschenbusch and different African American leaders shaped a trajectory that eventually would wrap itself into the work of Martin Luther King Jr. And it was a wonderful thesis.
I think we're all
so
surprised
good
that that's what your daughter did.
Well, interestingly enough, everybody always says, "Oh, do you want to be a minister?" And she would say to them, "Oh no," she said, "believe me, I know way too much about what it means to be a minister from my mom." And I was like, "I'm not even a clergy person." She said, "But Mom, all your friends are clergy." She said, "I've heard everything." And so anyway,
Yeah.
she's training to be a lawyer, and it's great. She has her own life. She's taken the whole vision of it, and she got it to where it needs to be in her mid-20s, and she's a great human, and I'm really proud of her.
Well, all right, this is the last question, because I didn't want to not do this one. But do remember, everyone, we have the whole special bonus Q&A thing with Dom. And
Right.
then after that, we'll have a ruining dinner session where Diana and I will basically take what we do before we actually hit record here and do it for an extended period of time and pick up some of these questions around religion, politics, and culture for those in the cottage and homebrew groups. But here's the last question. All right. So if you knew you were preaching your last sermon and it was going to be a gospel text, which gospel text would you want? What you going to do with that sermon? And I just want you to know, listen, Sandy, like when I saw this question, I said to myself, well, I know my answer, but I really want to know what Diana says.
Oh, that's terrible. It changes every year.
See, you see, I bet I would have picked the same text forever. That's why. See, I was very interested in how you'd respond to this. I want to know, like, so I have like literal favorite story, and I preached it a billion times in different ways. And but I don't. I want to know what your answer is, and it changing. So this doesn't mean you have to like think about the fact you might die today. That's not like a part of the way the question. Like,
Yeah. I know actually there are two that really I can never get away from. The two texts that really haunt me. One is the story of the woman at the well. And there's all kinds of reasons why that story haunts me and why I love it so much. It was part of the 48-month adventure, as it were, when everything was going bad. I actually read a book that was called Women at the Well. And it was a book that reinterpreted, I mean, and this is so rare for all these years ago, but it reinterpreted all of the texts of Jesus and women from the perspective of a spiritual direction. And I can just remember reading that story, which was the lead story, why it was called the book called Women at the Well. And there was something about that moment in time and that whole space that the story came into me, and it was utterly transformative, and it was exactly what I needed. And so that became a favorite story, and I preached on it numerous times. And I just think there's so many dimensions of it that are remarkable, that it's a story you could preach on literally for a lifetime and probably never get it all. So that one, but the last couple of years, the one that has spoken about as strongly to me as the woman at the well is Mary Magdalene at the resurrection in John. I love the resurrection chapter in the Gospel of John. I am fascinated by it. I can't get away from it. It's part of Diana's power about, when I got all excited about, yes, I believe in the resurrection. For God's sake, leave me alone last week, It's like, I just love that chapter, and I am playing with it. I have been preaching on it. I use it as examples all the time. So there's something going on with me and Mary Magdalene in that story that I am going to be working with for a while still. And I don't quite know entirely why, but it really, see what it did? Look, it makes my face happy. It's the whole thing. So those two stories, I'd be hard pressed to pick one.
well, I'm not surprised the Mary one was in there. I haven't heard you bring it up. Mine is Zacchaeus.
Oh, I love that story too.
Yeah. And when I was doing my master's, I picked the master's thesis option because I wanted to do a PhD, and it was post-colonial Christology, and it was then centered on a post-colonial Christological account of Jesus's mission. And so I did these theological readings of different kind of missiological passages. And the one that was most important to me was Zacchaeus, because Zacchaeus is a Jew who decides to cooperate with Rome to be the chief tax collector.
Yeah.
In the Gospel of Luke, where you meet Zacchaeus, none of the others, he goes through Jericho. So this is like if you're a redaction critic, like what is the author of Luke's theology? It's like, let us show you something that I think is important theologically. So this is not like, oh, this is a historical thing. This is let me tell you the theological truth that's important to me. So how does Jesus take Jericho? Before what happened last time God took Jericho, singing around it.
Oh, this is great. Down,
genocide. This time, what happens right before Jesus gets to Jericho? He heals a blind man who was yelling for Jesus, and the disciples told him to shut up. Jesus heals him, and then the disciples sing and dance because Jesus healed somebody. And that's what leads them into Jericho. Jesus sees Zacchaeus up in a tree and knows his name. And in the book, the the dissertation, I joke about, why he knew his name, because every religious group likes to gossip. And they knew the short, well-dressed guy is the guy that taxes the shit out of them. And so he knew who it was. And everyone, like, you may not know everyone, the people your friends know, but you know the people that complain about the most. And anyway, so he comes down and it's like, Zach, we're gonna have a party. You have a nice wine cellar, given what you've been up to. We're gonna go to your house. And that's when he says, look, I'm obviously too rich. I'm giving away half of what I have. And if I find out I've defaulted and stolen from these people, I'm going to give back threefold, kind of thing. And that whole thing's built around the laws of theft, which means in the story, it resonated with me that if you start to look at the details, you realize a lot of your privilege is actually theft. And unlike most people in gospel narratives that fit with my own identity, a privileged guy in the dominant structure, he's called a child of Abraham. Matthew's the other character. Everyone else I can think of that I have any real close relations to, not a positive outlook. And so what does Zacchaeus do? He recognizes the oppression of the way the system has dehumanized his neighbor. He invites him over to dinner, opens up his wine cellar for a party, and then promises that as he learns about the ways he's stolen and dehumanized them, to treat it as theft.
Yep.
And I think that's like the minimal viable response for those of us in the church that carry lots of privilege. And yet, but that is a model where Jesus says truly he's the son of Abraham. And I think it's so hard, if you're honest, when you look at structures and systems of oppression, that anyone in the inheriting large amounts of privilege should ever bear, it would ever get Jesus saying this is a child of Abraham. As a Jesus encounters Zacchaeus, it's like a promissory note that if you really are faithful, this is possible. And not like a works righteousness way, but just like a being honest about how shitty our system is.
Yeah.
And
I wrote about that text in Grateful, and I used it as I didn't know you had done that, because I used it as an example of an unjust structure, and that Jesus is attacking basically an unjust structure in this encounter with Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus repents. So I'm right. All right. I see the twist that you took on that, and I love it. I think that's just right. It's an exciting text. People, it's so funny. We teach it to little kids. Basically, we're teaching them this radical social vision. Jesus told the guy to get out of the
problem
tree.
when we teach it to the kids is we teach them, Zacchaeus, you come down, right? But he's not coming down to a lecture. He's coming down to an affirmation,
right?
Like Zacchaeus probably compromised with Rome because he wanted his kids to get fed.
Right. Yeah. He's both the victim and the victimizer.
Yeah. And then he wants to know, do I have a place in God's dream? And Jesus says, yeah, you do. And it involves you throwing a party. And I think that would be a beautiful model for people with privilege, for congregations and institutions that have resources, to be like, what would it mean to throw a party for all those whose identities and communities and stuff have been excluded and marginalized? How would we celebrate that? We're at the end of the party, the differentials in power are different. That's exciting. There are also these 3 chapters on spaving and post-colonial theory before I get to it.
It seems worthwhile to say and underscore the party is at a table. is
Yes.
it, and that we have spent so much time talking about that. And here we're coming up to Holy Week. And next Thursday, of course, is Maundy Thursday, the time of the Holy Revolution. And you end it with that great story where Zacchaeus doesn't come down out of the tree because Jesus is, basically ordered him to. Zacchaeus is choosing, and he chooses to then just, you can tell he's just like overwhelmed, and he invites Jesus to dinner. Well, Jesus invites himself to dinner, and Zacchaeus and he are at the table. I mean, it's just great stuff. So it's
Yes.
an appropriate way to think about going to Holy Week, is that we've talked so much about solidarity, eating together with the revolution of the table. Looks like a Lord who isn't over, but a Lord who calls people to eat and drink, to party.
Awesome. All right. It's almost 1:20 in the morning here.
Yeah, you got to go to bed.
Yeah, because I'm going around Paris tomorrow, but
Yay!
I really enjoyed this. And remember, everyone, to send your Bible questions, and they can be pretty broad because Dom will answer almost anything. And I found that since he speaks out all the time, he has high quality, punchy, short, witty answers to lots of questions.
He's so good at that. He's so Irish.
So yeah, send in those questions.
Witticisms.
And in what I just loved everyone's questions. Like, y'all sent so many good ones that I got to have fun conversations. Well, Dom answered some already. Helen, which most of y'all probably hadn't got to hear yet, and Matt Novenson did it, and I'm saving them so when other people come on that I can interview related to, I can bring them up. So it's very good. But especially there are so many questions around Jesus and patriarchy. The second half of the Helen conversation around a new book is so good.
Oh wow.
I just don't not listen to it. And she's got like the coolest posh UK accent. I just think it's
so go for it.
Yeah, it's like you feel like she should work at Hogwarts.
Well, as we're finishing up, those of you who are still on and want to hear Dom before we have that conversation with Dom on the 21st, if you're part of the paid community at the cottage, the financially supporting community, you'll just get a link automatically on Monday, where you can come to that live conversation between me and Dom, and there will be time for you to personally ask Dom questions. He and I will talk for about a half hour, and then we're going to open it up. And in my much smaller podcast for the cottage, part of the reason why it has the paywall in front of it, is people are really good, and it's smaller, and so there's an intimacy about it that I am very trusting of the community, that you can just talk to Dom Crossan, and it should be really interesting and fun, and I trust you all with that space. So if you are at the cottage, you all get the cottage for free, but there is a subscriber part to it, and I invite you to support me in that way, because it helps pay for that work. And that's what we're going to be doing Monday at the cottage. And you don't have to sign up special for it. It just gets delivered to you if you're on that list. So I am happy to have as many people from this class who want to be over there and have that great conversation with Dom. And I'm going to tone it to Holy Week as well, and just sort of ask him some specific questions about that. So the cottage is just, it says, can you give us a link? Jay,
you can put it in the email.
Oh, that would be great.
So tomorrow sometime, it might not be early because I'm going to be in Paris, but when my kids are asleep tomorrow, you'll get an email with the video and stuff from today. I'll put a link in there for the cottage stuff. And Diane, you can send me anything you want me to send about it. But the main thing is like there's like her newsletter, and then there's like the elect, but it's there's no double predestination involved in this. You have the opportunity of opting in to the elect, and those are the wonderful people that made the wise decision to support her ongoing work. And given the kind of crap the New York Times put out today, like it would be a great idea to do so, because
Thank you.
just saying. Yeah, and it's a group that is trustworthy enough to let the people participate. Given the crazy emails and comments I get from people that listen to the podcast, there's no chance I would just let the general people listen ask questions. The homebrewed people can recommend, the people in the community recommend guests and stuff, and send in questions, but that'd be dangerous. I think half the time they would just lecture me about my heresy, but they probably wouldn't even care about who I was talking to. Those really conservative traditional types, the team trad that hate listen to the podcast. They also like to follow your Twitter, and
yes, they do. And that's why, that's one of the reasons why, the paywall actually works, is because I can actually create safer conversations without trolls. And if somebody decides to pay and then they become a troll, I refund their money and that's it. They're gone. It's like, so, but if you're on the cottage, and you all should be, you get about 80% of what I produce. But then there's this other part that I really try to make very special for the people who financially support the cottage, and it means a lot to me. And everybody, it's a great group. I rarely have trouble with it. So maybe people are used to how quickly Diana will block and mute.
Oh. Well, plus if you're in that group, then you can join next time we do Ruining Dinner. And since Diana and I have spent the last 6 weeks talking about this, the volume of politics and religion intersections that have piled up is significant.
We've got a lot of stuff on our list.
Yeah. All right, but I'm gonna
Tripp,
dream about it.
You need to go, and I'm just going to end with a 2-line poem.
Oh, 2 lines,
which is a perfect way to wrap, I think, up this part of our adventure together. This is from Robert Frost's poem, Directive. Here are your waters and your watering place. Drink and be whole again, beyond confusion.
Thank you, Diana.
Have a great Holy Week, everyone.
And thank you, everyone. It's been a part of this. It's been wonderful. And even if we didn't answer every question and stuff, I've read all the emails. I haven't been able to respond to them all, but I feel really honored that y'all shared so much. So thank you.
Have a great time in Paris.